Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. I'm so excited and happy to be here at Podfiesta and to talk with all of you. My name is Kriselle Gabriel, and I am the founder and host of Empowered in Color and the Empowered in Color podcast, where we are all about helping people of color thrive in both business and in life. I've been running Empowered in Color for the last 3 years, but have been in this online business space and doing a lot of different other projects, entrepreneurial ventures for the last 8 years now. So I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you all about authentic storytelling and why audiences want to hear about your struggles as they happen. Now, you might be reading that title and you might be feeling a little bit apprehensive or nervous about it because let's be real, most people do not talk about things that they're struggling with as they're dealing with it and as they're working through it. And that's completely understandable. So I don't blame you for feeling a little bit nervous, especially if you are a little bit on the shyer side. But if you are the kind of person that does share your struggles and has shared your struggles in the past, even if you shared it like way after the fact, after you were really far removed from said struggle, then I would encourage you to still listen to today's session with an open mind and consider if this way of storytelling might be a fit for you and could help not only you in your business, but like help you with your community and your audience. And I will have to start this session with a couple of different prefaces and warnings and caveats. But obviously, this type of storytelling is not meant for everyone. And if you decide not to tell your story in this way, then that doesn't make you an inauthentic storyteller. But as I'll go into in a little bit, the definition of authentic storytelling has really changed over the years. So if you want to stand out, you know, this is something to consider. But again, not this kind of storytelling is not meant for everyone, not every personality, and not every podcast, because obviously, depending on the nature of your podcast, this might just not be relevant at all. If your podcast is a history podcast, you're probably not talking about yourself very much on it, right? But if your podcast is about entrepreneurship or motherhood or whatever it may be pertaining to you and where you share a little bit of your story and not so much you teaching something to somebody, then you may be talking a little bit about yourself. And this kind of authentic storytelling is something that you can consider. But before we get started and really dive deep into that, I do want to introduce myself because a lot of you probably don't know who I am. My name is Kriselle Gabriel, like I said, from Empowered in Color, and I live in Las Vegas, Nevada. So I'm in America, but I did live in Australia for about a year and a half from 2016 to 2017 in Sydney. And I miss it all the time. I miss it every day. And it's actually while I was living in Australia that I got into podcasting and decided that that was something that I wanted to do. And I just didn't execute it until I actually got back here to America. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. I do a lot of work with diversity and inclusion. If you haven't been able to tell by the name Empowered in Color and our slogan, which is helping people of color thrive in both business and in life. So I'm really, really passionate about helping people, especially people of color, find their voice, find their way, and breaking past what society has told us we can or cannot do, or maybe unlearning certain things that our parents have told us are the only ways to success. And we can't blame them for that, right? Because we're thinking about survival. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me. And I'm going to go right into this because I don't want to waste any time. So, like I said, today we're going to be talking about authentic, and I use that in quotes on purpose, authentic storytelling, and why your audience wants to hear you talking about your struggles as you're going through them. So, like I said before, this is not going to be for everyone, and that's okay. But I do encourage you to take a listen and consider if maybe you can incorporate parts of this type of storytelling into your podcast. So let's first define what authentic means, right? We hear a lot about authenticity on social media nowadays because so much of social media is very curated and very perfect, right? People are able to use social media to create this picture of a life that they're living, whether that is real or not. And so, people talking about authenticity online has been coming up more and more because we've seen the harms of the internet on young people and even older people, a lot of times dealing with mental health, but it's also just misleading, right? Especially if you're in the online business space. A lot of people inflating the money that they're earning, the clients that they're getting, things like that. And people who follow them might try to follow their same formula and they're not getting the same results. And they might be feeling really insecure about themselves, down in the dumps as to why that is the case, when in reality, they're just not being completely truthful. So that's kind of why that authenticity movement has started. But because more and more people, keep talking about authenticity, be authentic, be real, be transparent to your audience, it's it's losing its meaning, right? It doesn't mean the same thing. It doesn't have the same weight as it did a few years ago. And that's not to say that authenticity marketing doesn't work, but now it just means that we need to find different ways on how we're going to approach it. Obviously, the biggest thing is telling your story your way because your story is unique to you and no one can take that away from you. But besides that, what else can you do, right? Because everyone else is telling their own story. How can I tell my story in a different way than how everyone else is doing it? And that's where today's session comes in, where we talking about struggles as you're dealing with them. Because most of the time, when someone does share their struggles on social media, it is usually after the fact. And what that means is that can be anywhere from it happened, last week or a couple weeks ago or something, or it could have been a story that they're telling of an experience they had years and years ago. And in the online business space, especially if you're trying to promote your business with your podcast, turn it into something more than just that, um, that's a lot of people in the online business space will take lessons that they've learned from earlier times in their life and things like that to relate it to business. So where do you go from here, right? Everyone's telling their stories. Now what? So I have 4 main reasons / tips on why we should be telling our stories a little bit sooner than us being so far removed from it, right? Like a lot of times these people, especially again with online business owners who are podcasters or maybe they're not podcasters, they just have a business and they have a social media following of any kind, they'll usually talk about how they started out in X way and they worked their way up and now they're a millionaire, now they make 6 figures, now they make $10,000 a month, whatever it is, right? They say we started here and now we're here. And obviously that's great, right? It's really inspiring because you see, when someone's telling their story, especially if it's on a podcast, you can listen along and imagine and envision their journey as they're telling it. I started like this, I started here with my single mother doing this, and we struggled to have food on the table. We struggled to get to school, whatever it was. And then, I worked hard and I did these kinds of things, and I dealt with this. I was homeless for a period of time, or I got into a lot of debt, or I was in a bad relationship, whatever it is. And then after those events happened, I did this and this, and now here I am. When you hear that kind of, the format. And it's obviously really inspiring to hear it. But here's the but. And this is where I go into reason number 1, why we should tell our stories a little bit sooner rather than later. Once you hear those kinds of stories over and over again, even though they are inspiring to hear, in terms of relating it to your own experience and what you're doing, depending on what your success has or hasn't been with your podcast and or business, you can feel really discouraged actually. Instead of feeling inspired, it might actually make you really discouraged. Reason number 1 on why you should tell your story sooner rather than later and your struggles is we are a jaded society. It's a really sad reality. With social media, we have access to everything at our fingertips, and we have access to it instantly. And we have access to lots of things at our fingertips as well. And so that means that we're getting so many stories, so much content bombarded onto us on any given day at any given moment. And so when you're building an audience, especially with a podcast, it can be really, really discouraging for you to continue to listen to these wonderful success stories. But again, when these people tell these stories of their struggles, they're usually so far removed from it. So, like, it happened to them years ago. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it happened to them years ago, or maybe even months ago. And you are sitting there and you're tired because you're trying your hardest. You're doing whatever you can to grow your audience and tell your own story and build your brand and whatever it is, but it's not working for you, right? Especially when you follow some of these gurus or celebrities or influencers or whoever. You can try what they're doing. They'll tell you, this is how I did this. And when they tell their stories, that's usually how they do it, right? They say, I was in this really bad situation and I did these things and I got out of it. But you could be trying every single thing that these people are doing and you're still not there. You're still not making that $10,000 a month sales, right? You're still not at $1 million. You're still not at this many downloads or followers to a point where you're making passive income, whatever it is. You're still not doing this after listening to all these stories and trying everything that they're saying. So, and kind of like with anything in life, if you hear it too many times, it's not going to mean as much, right? Kind of like how I was saying earlier with the word authentic or authenticity. We've heard that word used so many times in relation to marketing and PR and storytelling that the word doesn't mean it, the meaning of it isn't as strong. It doesn't feel as powerful as it used to feel when people first started talking about it a few years ago. So when you're feeling so discouraged and jaded and tired, what can you do? Well, telling your story sooner rather than later can kind of help with that. And all of these reasons and tips kind of flow into one another. So I will go into the second one right now. So the reason why, if you're feeling jaded and tired of hearing all of these stories and you're like, when is it going to be me? When you tell your story as it's happening, and I'm going to preface this by saying I don't mean you need to tell your entire life. Obviously, you don't need to say every single thing happening. But let's say your podcast is about running a business, kind of like mine is. You know, telling your business story, your entrepreneurial story, your founder story as it's happening can be really encouraging because people can relate to that. People hearing other people like them who are dealing with similar things, but they're still doing amazing work, but they're not at that top tier yet. They're still not, at that level where you hear all of these big millionaires, these big entrepreneurs, these big podcasters, where you hear that they're at. They may not be there yet, but you love their work, you love their story, but at the same time, they're also going through it. They're dealing with stuff just like you. And, obviously, we know as humans that people are going through things, whether they say something to you about it or not. It's just a fact of life. But even though we know that in our heads, actually hearing it from someone else means so much more than just knowing it because it validates it, right? So the second reason why we should be telling our stories as we're still in the thick of it is that people can relate to you and they'll feel less alone. If you're someone that has a very small but engaged audience, that can make them even bigger fans of you because they're like, wow, they really felt like they could trust us enough to share something like that with us. That makes me feel great. That makes me feel like I'm not alone. That gives me the willpower to keep going because they're telling their story. And even though they are amazing, I love their podcast, I love their work, they're still going through it. So that's, and it's really beautiful to hear. For me personally, even though my podcast does focus on entrepreneurship, I also believe and talk about on the podcast that everything is tied together, even your personal life. And again, I'm not saying you need to, if you're having a lot of issues like with your relationships or your kids or something like that, like you don't need to delve all that. You don't need to go into that and tell people about that. There are definitely things for me that I keep to myself that I'm still working on, that I still wait until after the fact to tell. So I'm saying this to you that with everything that I'm saying in today's session, to use your own discretion, use a little bit of tact in what you say, how you say it, and when you say it, right? There's certain things that you don't want to say until you're removed from it, and that's okay. But maybe there are other things that you are dealing with and struggling with that you can talk about right now. So an example for me, when I was going through the worst depression of my life um, and some issues within my marriage at the time, back in 2019, I didn't talk about that until after the fact. I couldn't. It was such a not horrible, but it was such a dark time in my life. I couldn't bring myself to even produce any episodes of the podcast. So I definitely wasn't going to be telling my story as I was going through it, right? So that I told after I was feeling a lot better and a lot healthier of a mental state. And I got a really good response out of it. But even then, I told that story like maybe a month or so or a few weeks after, all of this happened. So I wasn't too far removed. But then there's other things that I'll talk about in real time, like when I hosted our annual Empowered Summit. It's a virtual summit that we host every year. This year was our second year. And I talked openly on the podcast about what worked and what didn't when I did a little recap episode, a little debriefing episode. and what I would change and what I would do better for next year. And there were a lot of mishaps that happened in that process, but I talked about it like immediately after it happened. And so there's different things like that, or how I talk about my mental illness. I talk about how I'm working through that. I talk about that on the podcast and I talk about it on social media so people know like what I'm dealing with. But I don't talk about every single detail of my personal life. So that's something that I really want to make sure that you all are aware of and keep in mind, that when I'm saying talk about your struggles in real time, I'm not saying tell everyone every single part of your life. No, you can pick and choose. And I don't ever want people to feel like they need to tell someone something if they're not comfortable, especially if you're talking about a traumatic experience. Definitely don't talk about that if you don't feel comfortable, right? I have some traumatic experiences that I like barely talk about even to my own husband because it's just so traumatic for me. I'll talk about it with a therapist, but I really won't say much else outside of that, right? And I'm an open book. So keep all of that in mind when you're trying to figure out what parts of your story to share. Only share what you would feel comfortable with. So, the number three reason why you should be telling your story and things you're struggling with more in the moment is that it gives accountability. There's a term that people are starting to use. I kind of hate that people are starting to use it, but it does perfectly describe what I'm doing at least, and it's called building in public. What does that mean? You are talking about you building your brand, building your business, building your app, product, whatever it is, and you're talking about what you're doing with it, what's working well, what isn't, in real time. A lot of times that's on social media like Twitter. A lot of founders use Twitter for that, but it can also be on places like your podcast or your blog or YouTube channel, something like that. It's something that more and more people are doing. And it's something that I have always done. That's just how I've been. It's part of my personality. I'm a very open person. I don't have a problem with telling people things and talking about things that might seem taboo to most. And I love talking about things as they're happening because it gives you accountability. Because now these people, your audience, they know what your goals are. They know what you're struggling with and what you're dealing with. So now they can hold you accountable and say, hey, Kriselle, it's been a month since you talked about that thing. How are you going with that? Where are you at with that? So it can give you motivation because now it's not just in your head and you're kind of struggling by yourself. I mean, yes, tell other people in your real life too, but sometimes telling your audience can be even more encouraging. So, accountability. And the last reason why I think you should be telling your story while you're in the thick of it, talking about your struggles while you're dealing with them, is that when you get to that point, when you have that breakthrough, when you make that big sale, when you have that successful launch, whatever it is, or maybe you hit 10,000 downloads, I don't know. People are more likely to celebrate with you even more and feel more involved in the celebration and of your successes because they heard you talking about it from the very beginning when you had no idea what you were doing and you didn't know how you were going to get there. Now that you are at that place, people will be like, wow, she really did it. He really did it. It's gonna keep me going. I can do it too. So over time, people are literally growing with you. And even if You just announce it as a goal and say, hey, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but this is what I'm going to do. And then a few months later, you actually accomplish it. People will be able to look at that and say, oh my gosh, they really did do that. They really did. And they're invested. When people are invested in you, emotionally, financially, whatever, as customers, as your audience, when you're successful, it makes your success feel more personal to them. It's not just oh, that's cool, that's a cool story. It makes them feel like they were involved, that they played a role in your success. And that can increase your bond with your audience even more and make you feel more connected to them. So, yeah, those are the 4 reasons on why I think that we should be telling our stories sooner rather than later. Like I said, there's so many caveats to keep in mind. There is still a value in so-called building in silence. There is a value in that, but with our society being bombarded with so many types of stories and narratives every single day, they need to hear that they're not alone, especially because with the pandemic, for many people still around the world, they are still alone, like physically alone. And hearing someone going through something similar to them, or even just knowing that they're struggling too, can be enough to keep someone going. And it's a beautiful thing. So that's all I have to say for today's session. I hope that it was useful for you, and I hope that you can take bits and pieces of what I was talking about today and apply it to your podcast and your show and your business, however you see it's relevant. Like I said, don't share your entire life. You don't need to. But I think there are more parts about us that we can share that are less shameful as we might think that they are. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much. If you want to keep in touch with me, you can follow us at Empowered in Color on Instagram. Our website is empoweredincolor.co, and color is spelled COLOR, not UR. So take out the U. And yeah, if you have any other questions, please feel free to send me an email at hello@empoweredincolor.co. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Podfiesta. Bye.